Hey folks, as usual, I have been keeping my eye out for new releases from independent publishers and university presses, and I have a huge list of books that were published within the last month to share with you today. I apologize for the buzzing in the background. It is very smoky today in Chicago from all the wildfires going on, and so we have our air filter running on full blast. Actually, all three of our air filters running on full blast today. I'm going to zoom through this list because there are so very many books to get through, and I guarantee there are books for every kind of reader on this list that I'm going to share. So I promise you that there is something for you here today in the books that I'm going to share. And if anything jumps out to you that sounds like something you might want to pick up, please share it in the comments below. I'm always so interested to hear what kind of books speak to different kinds of people. So if you don't mind, share in the comments below what you might pick up from this list, or what you already have picked up, or maybe already even read from this list. These aren't in any particular order except for kind of chronological order, because that's how I happen upon the books in the world. That's how I add them to the list, is based on when they were published. So they're kind of chronological based on when in June 2023 they were published. So let's start off with a book published by West Virginia University Press. It's a memoir by Kelley Shinn that's called The Wounds That Bind Us. The author shares her life story of how she was orphaned at birth and then lost her legs at the age of 16 to a bacterial pathogen, and then later becomes an avid off-road racer, and then as a single mom of a 3-year-old decides to pick up her life and her 3-year-old's life and journey to former war zones to advocate for people who have been impacted by landmines. It's described as like a harrowing journey filled with great characters and landscapes, and just sounds really fantastic. From Europa Editions is a novel called The Road to Dalton. This is a debut novel that's set in 1990 in the state of Maine, in a small town, and it sounds like it's one of those portraits of a small community type novels that follows mostly the lives of 3 different couples within the town, and then the town is left reeling after the death of a young mother, and so you kind of see the aftermath of that event. From the Feminist Press is a short story collection called Happy Stories Mostly, and this is by Norman Erikson Pasaribu, and it's translated by Tiffany Tsao. And you might have seen this book popping up because it was longlisted for the 2022 International Booker Prize. So it was published a while back in the UK, but is just now being published in the United States by the Feminist Press. The author is an Indonesian writer, and these stories are described as absurdist and speculative fiction, exploring colonial violence and anti-queer prejudice, and following characters who are just on the brink of achieving happiness, or are in constant search of this idea of happiness, but not quite ever getting there. For example, there is one story that is told, I believe is told by a new employee in the Department of Unanswered Prayers and in Heaven. From Tin House is a novel by Claire Fuller called The Memory of Animals, and I've seen some mixed reviews on this, but the premise sounds fantastic. This is the story of a marine biologist who's living during a global pandemic, and she signs up for a vaccine trial and then finds herself locked up in this hospital with the other participants in the vaccine trial while chaos descends in the world around them. And one of the other people in the hospital with her has developed this technology that allows people to relive their memories. And so the main character withdraws into her memories. And Kirkus describes it as a memorable meditation on how the human struggle to survive in captivity is not so different than that of our animal kin. From Norton is a collection of linked short stories called Innards by the author Magogodi oaMphela Makhene. And this is set in Soweto, South Africa, and it spans from the early years of apartheid and beyond. And from Norton's website, it says, Innards tells the intimate stories of everyday Black folks processing the savagery of apartheid with grit, wit, and their own distinctive, bewildering humor. And it says it's rich with the thrilling textures of township language and life. And I believe it's a debut collection as well. From New Directions is a new book from Jenny Erpenbeck, translated by Michael Hofmann, called Kairos. Erpenbeck is a celebrated German author, and this is the story of a romance that begins in the late 1980s. And it follows two lovers, a very, very young woman, who I think is 19 at the beginning, and a much older man. And it's described as a complicated, thorny relationship that is evolving under the weight of a huge historical moment as Eastern Germany collapses. It's described as the collision of sweeping history with the very, very personal lives of these two characters. I love Jenny Erpenbeck's work, so I'm really excited to check this one out. From Deep Vellum is a novel called Ivan and Phoebe, and this is by Oksana Lutsyshyna, and it is translated by Nina Murray. This novel is described as having a really unique poetic form, and it tells the story of Ivan and Phoebe, who are a young married couple who are involved in the student protests in Ukraine in the 1990s, and it follows them as they're really grappling with very public issues such as living in post-Soviet society, as well as private issues of family and marriage. And also, I believe Phoebe is a poet, or wants to be a poet, and so I think that's where the very poetic form comes in as well. From $2 Radio is a book that I'm actually reading right now. It's called At the Edge of the Woods, and it's by Kathryn Bromwich, and this is the story of Laura, who lives kind of a secluded life in a small cabin in the Italian Alps. She's really kind of alienated from the rest of the townspeople, and you can tell she has a bit of a mysterious past, and one day a figure from her past knocks on her door, and that's where I have just actually stopped reading this morning. So someone has just knocked at her door, and it's the descriptions of the natural world and of the small community she kind of lives just outside of are absolutely gorgeous. So I'm loving it so far. And again, this is from $2 Radio. I don't know if I said that. From Pushkin Press is a book called Small Fires, an Epic in the Kitchen, and it's by Rebecca May Johnson. And this is nonfiction. This is a kind of a memoir about the author's life in cooking. And in the memoir, the author explores cooking as a vital source of intellectual fulfillment. And from the publisher's website, it says, Johnson awakens us to the richness of cooking as a means of experiencing the self and the world, and to the revolutionary potential of the small fires burning in every kitchen. From Pegasus Books is a biography called Lady Caroline Lamb, and this is by Antonia Fraser, and this is the story of Lady Caroline Lamb and her scandalous love affair with Lord Byron, and from the publisher's website, it describes that love affair as overshadowing her own creativity and desire to break free from society's constraints. And it sounds like she was quite the character, so that sounds like I'm not a big reader of biographies, but that one kind of jumped out at me. From Coach House Books is a novel called Not Anywhere, Just Not, and it is by Ken Sparling. And this is described as an absurdist, metaphysical, uncanny, quietly unsettling novel that's about a married couple who's been married for decades. All of a sudden, the husband disappears, and the wife in this marriage is left kind of wondering, if he's going to come back, and who she is without him. Like, what does her identity mean without her husband, since they've been connected and together for so long. From the University Press of Kentucky is a poetry collection called Gay Poems for Red States by Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. And this poetry collection is by a former English high school teacher who resigned his position due to harassment that he and his students were experiencing, and due to the fact that the administration of the school was doing nothing about this harassment. And so from the publisher's website, it says, Carver's earnest and heartfelt verses are for those wishing to discover and understand the vastness of Appalachia, and for the LGBTQ plus Appalachians who long for a future, for a home in an often unwelcoming place. From Unnamed Press is a thriller called Housewoman, and it's by Adora Noira. And I've definitely seen this one around. So again, this is a thriller about a woman who travels from Lagos to Texas for an arranged marriage. And instead of encountering this perfect all-American life that she envisioned, she instead finds herself in a precarious and disturbing family situation and finds herself trapped in kind of a dangerous web of conflicting desires. From Norton is a poetry collection called When I Waked, I Cried to Dream Again, and it is by A. Van Jordan. And this is a collection of poetry and prose, actually, that investigates the roots of racist violence, particularly American state violence against Black people in this country. And it draws on a large set of influences, but including Black characters within Shakespearean plays. And from the publisher's website, it says, the poet invents a new form of window poems based on a characterization exercise to see Shakespeare's Black characters in 3 dimensions and finds contemporary parallels in the way these characters are othered, rendered at once undesirable and hypersexualized, a threat and a joke. And then it says, at once a stunning inquiry into the roots of racist violence and a moving recognition of the joy of Black youth before the world takes hold. From Heyday Books is a book called The Questions That Matter Most, Reading, Writing, and the Exercise of Freedom. And this is by the novelist Jane Smiley. And this is a collection of literary criticism that weaves the personal history of her move from Iowa to California with literary history, examining the writers that influence her work the most. And it lists such writers as Marguerite de Navarre, Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Louisa May Alcott, Mark Twain, Willa Cather, Franz Kafka, Haldor Laxness, and Jessica Mitford. I do like Jane Smiley's work, so this jumped out at me. The next book, I think I just gotta read the blurb because it is so fantastic. It's from Ugly Duckling Press, and it's called Joan of Arkansas, and it's by Emma Whipperman. And from the blurb from the publisher's website says, Joan of Arkansas is an election season closet drama. 15-year-old Joan has been tasked by God, they, them, to ensure that Charles VII, Republican Arkansas, adopts radical climate policy and wins his bid as the Lord's candidate to become the President of the United States. Arkansas is flooding, the West is burning, and borders are closed. That just sounds very unique. Also from Ugly Duckling Press is not a new release, but a reissue of a pamphlet called Say Translation is Art, and this is by Sawako Nakayasu. I first encountered this author on a podcast that I love and mention all the time called Between the Covers. She's a writer and a translator. And this is an exploration of how translation is both an action and an art in an age when translators aren't even always listed on the covers of the books they translate. And the pamphlet is a series of sentences that all start the same way. They all start with the word say, like the title, Say Translation is Art. One of the most beautiful and interesting things about this is that it can be read as both an imperative, like I'm telling you, say translation is art. Or it can be read as like an invitation to imagine. So like, let's say translation is an art. So it's both imperative and an invitation to imagine, which I think is so beautiful. You can check it out online. I encourage you to go, if you're interested, I encourage you to buy the pamphlet, but you can actually read the whole thing online. From Other Press is a novel called Demoiselle of Numidia, and this is by Mohamed Lefta, and it's translated by Lara Vergniaud. I'm not sure how to say her last name. This is a book I actually saw recently on the amazing channel Elise Reads. I think she had just recently picked up this book as well. This was originally published in French in 1992, and it says it established Lefta as one of Morocco's great writers, but it's available only now for the first time in English. And it's a novel about the lives of young women who are living in a brothel in Casablanca. So I subscribed to the publisher's newsletter and I got a really great email about this book. And I want to quote a bit from that email that I got. The email said, "There is no question that Mohammad Lefta's work can be perceived as explosive and therefore dangerous, not only in his homeland, but for us too." So Lefta died in 2008, and his other great work, which is called Captain Nimat's Last Battle, is also published in English by other press, but the author actually insisted that this novel, Captain Nimat's Last Battle, wouldn't be published until after his death. And in that publisher's email that I just mentioned, they write, read the book, Captain Nimat's Last Battle, and you'll understand why he wanted it to be published after his death, which of course makes me all sorts of intrigued to read that book as well. From Soho Press is a literary crime novel called Killingly, and it's by Kathryn Buettner. And this is actually based on a real-life unsolved mystery from the late 19th century. So it's set in 1897, and a female student from Mount Holyoke College goes missing, and her father and her sister come to campus to frantically join the search. The one person who might actually have the answers is the missing girl's best friend, whose name is Agnes, who seems to be hiding something. And the description of the novel calls it a beautifully drawn historical portrait of queerness, family trauma, and the risks faced by women who dared to pursue unconventional paths at the end of the 19th century. From New York Review of Books is a novel called My Stupid Intentions, and this is by Bernardo Zanoni, and it's translated by Alex Andreas. Kirkus describes this as an animal story for adults, and this is a premise that has me giggling and hoping that it lives up to the description of the novel, which I'm just going to rip straight from New York Review of Books website. This is the autobiography of a beach martin named Archie. Born into poverty, maimed by an accident, he is sold into servitude by his mother and taught to read and write by Solomon, a pawnbroking fox, whose knowledge derived from a Bible that fell on his head while he was busy feeding on a hanged man. Even as Archie's life is transformed by his discovery of the written word and his grappling with the entity called God, he longs for an existence guided by instinct. He longs to be a real animal. Caught between his natural urges and his acquired knowledge, he seeks the meaning of his story by writing it. Here's another novel whose premise I hope lives up to what I'm hoping for it. This is from Norton, and it's a novel called Girlfriend on Mars, and it's by Deborah Willis. This is just the kind of book I am so tickled by. The title, the cover, the premise, everything. So this is the story of Amber, who joins a reality TV show to win one of the last seats on the first human-led mission to Mars. And it's also the story of her boyfriend, Kevin, who meanwhile is left wondering why his girlfriend is so desperate to leave the planet and him behind. That just sounds fun. From Coffee House Press is When the Hibiscus Falls, stories written by M. Evelina Galang. And these are 17 short stories exploring the lives of Filipino and Filipino-American women, not just living women, but also their ancestors. And they traverse time and space and generations all the way to a near future Florida, which I would love to read about. That sounds super interesting. And Lori Moore calls it pioneering, lyrical, and full of life. From Other Press is a novel called NIKI, and it's by Christos Komenidis, and it's translated by Patricia Felisa Barbato. This is another book that came with a really great email from the publisher that I thought was just a great story. So this book is the story of NIKI, who actually begins narrating her book from the beyond, from her coffin. The very first words of the book are, "Now that I am dead, laid out in my coffin, wrapped in my good white dress," and then the sentence goes on from there. So from that very, very unique setup, this is NIKI recounting her life story of herself and her family living in Greece through many of the great historical events of the 20th century. And it says that it's a tale of working class heroes, privileged elites, daring revolutionaries, and free-spirited bohemians. And the email from the publisher, the publisher is Judith Gerwich, publisher of Other Press, and it tells the story how she was in a taxi in New York, and the driver of the taxi happened to be Greek. And the publisher, Judith, goes, "Oh, have you heard of this author, Christos Komenides?" And the driver's like, "Yes, of course I've heard of this author. Such a great author, such a great Greek author." And the publisher is like, "Well, Other Press is bringing his novel NIKI to the U.S. for the very first time." And the taxi driver gets out the car and opens the door and is like, "Thank you so much for bringing this great work of Greek literature to the United States." At the end of the email, the publisher writes, "NIKI is truly wonderful. You cry, you cringe, you laugh, you hope, and you learn so much. The Greeks who invented democracy more than 2,000 years ago are clearly struggling to make it come back, unless, of course, it was never really what it claimed to be." From Bellevue Literary Press is a collection of 2 novellas called The Imposter, and it's from a Brazilian writer, Edgar Teles Ribeiro, and it's translated by Kim N. Hastings and Margaret A. Neves. The first novella is titled The Imposter, and it's about a man who travels with his wife to Italy and recalls a family legend about an uncle who was swallowed by Mount Vesuvius. And then the second novella is called Blue Butterflies of the Amazon, and it's about a woman who's been paralyzed by a stroke, but is observing the dynamics of her family. She's not able to interact in any way, but is observing kind of the changing dynamics of her family as they care for her and maneuver around her. From Two Lines Press is a collection of stories called Beijing Sprawl by Zhu Zechen, and it's translated from Chinese by Eric Abramson and Jeremy Tiang. And these are short stories. They're all connected tales about Beijing and the lives of the people who live at its margins. And it's described as having a looping, repetitive structure to the stories. And this repetitive form both highlights and kind of undermines the characters' hopes and dreams to escape from the daily mind-numbing rhythms of their lives. From Roundabout Press is a book called The Pain of Pleasure by Amy Grace Lloyd. And this is an atmospheric and erotic novel that is set in a headache clinic that is located in the basement of an abandoned church in Brooklyn. In the outside world, there's all of these storms raging in this very erratic weather patterns happening. And it's told in various perspectives in this headache clinic, including the doctor, who is treating patients' pain with very unorthodox methods, a nurse who has been hired to spy on the doctor, and then also a patient who has gone missing. And I think we get the story of that patient through the journals she's left behind that the doctor is reading through. There are tons of great blurbs about this book, including one from Lydia Yuknovich, who says, "This novel reminds me that to fully embrace life means to let go of easy binaries and enter embodiment without apology. Take the leap. This book is thrilling." From Tri-Quarterly Books, gosh, that's hard to wrap my mouth around. From Tri-Quarterly Books, which is the publisher of Northwestern University Press, is a short story collection I've mentioned a couple times already. It's called Direct Sunlight, and it's by the award-winning writer Christine Sneed. I'll read one of the great blurbs from the back from Dana Johnson, who's the author of Elsewhere, California and In the Not Quite Dark. And Johnson writes, "Christine Sneed's stories are glorious in their empathy and honesty, teasing out the nuanced bonds between family, friends, and lovers. Funny, profound, and moving, this collection reminds us of our humanity, of the beautiful vulnerability and tenderness we can extend to one another. Read this brilliant book now." This is one where the cover really got me here. This is called Breakaway, and it's from Broadstone Books. It's a poetry collection from Joey Nicoletti. The description from the publisher asks the question, how does a child make sense of the world? And the poet Joey Nicoletti grew up with an abusive father and a mother who moved out, I believe, due to the abusiveness of the father. Young Joey took refuge in comic books and science fiction and music and movies. And so this collection is about how the poet came to understand his own origin story through some of these pop culture and sci-fi references. And the cover is just awesome. From Tin House is another poetry collection called I Do Everything I'm Told, and this is from Megan Fernandez. And this poetry collection has gotten a lot of really great reviews from what I can see. And its poems span across thousands of miles, taking place in Shanghai and Brooklyn and Los Angeles and Lisbon and Palermo and Paris, Philadelphia, with a speaker who travels solo and encounters many different people along the way. And it says, from the publisher, it says, the collection explores disobedience and worship, longing and possessiveness, and nights of wandering cities. From Saraband Books, which is a publisher located in Kentucky, is an anthology called Once a City Said, a Louisville Poets Anthology. And this is edited by the poet Joy Priest, who has a really great poetry collection called Horsepower that I actually have. I saw her speak at an event once. It was a virtual event, but I really enjoyed the poetry that she read at that event and picked up her collection. And so she edited this anthology. From the publisher, it says, this collection showcases the polyvocal communities of Louisville, Kentucky, a city celebrated for its bourbon, basketball, and horse racing, but long fraught with racial injustice, police corruption, and social unrest. Priest takes the city's narrative out of the mouths of politicians, news anchors, and police chiefs and puts it into the mouths of poets. From Coach House Books is a novel called To the Forest by Anaïs Barbeau-Lavalette. This is a novel about two families who flee the city at the beginning of the pandemic and return to an old family home in the middle of the forest. And the children of these two families run off in the woods and are exploring the natural beauty of the forest and finding treasures along the way. And the narrator, Anaïs, is in the midst of this, seeking meaning in her ancestral roots and the violent beauty of the natural world. And it's described as quiet and jewel-like. From Charco Press is Fresh Dirt from the Grave by Giovanna Rivero, translated by Isabel Ady. And these are short stories from the Bolivian writer, and they're described as both dark and tender, full of buried bodies, lost children, violence, but also full of tenderness for all creatures. And from the publisher, it says, Rivero has reworked the boundaries of the Gothic to engage with pre-Columbian ritual, folk tales, sci-fi, and eroticism, and found in the wound their humanity and the possibility of hope. From Grey Wolf is a collection of short stories called Fat Time and Other Stories by Jeffrey Renard Allen. And this is speculative history, partially. It reimagines historical figures such as Jimi Hendrix, Francis Bacon, the boxer Jack Johnson, Miles Davis, and a space-age Muhammad Ali. And then along with those reinvented historical characters are fictional characters of the author's invention. And to quote the publisher, these are tender, painful depictions of Black life in urban America. And the stories also incorporate African notions of circular time in which past, present, and future exist all at once. From Europa Editions is a novel I've already seen around a bit called Mrs. S. It's by Kay Patrick. This is the story of a woman who is hired to be a matron at an elite English boarding school, and she feels completely out of place in this very privileged and hostile environment until she meets Mrs. S, who is the wife of the headmaster. And over the course of one summer, they begin an illicit affair of electric intensity. Another cover edition, this is from Bull City Press. It's Fantasy of Loving the Fantasy, also a great title, from Jennifer Funk. And these are poems, and this collection is described as a sensuous investigation of the failings and thrills of trying to sate the insatiable. And it says, Funk examines how domestication contends with wildness and what it costs the savage self to be cared for. And I read one review that says if you don't read a lot of poetry, this is a particularly accessible collection. And the reviewer also said that the meaning of this amazing cover becomes clearer the farther you get into the collection, which is cool. From an imprint called The Shortish Project, which is part of Outpost 19, is a novella called The Uncanny Case of Gilles Jeanette, and it's by Jill Dearman. And this is a gothic thriller novella, only 94 pages long, and it's a gender-swapped take on Jekyll and Hyde. I don't know if I need to say much more than that, but it's set in Hudson, New York during the Great Depression, and it follows a young woman, Jeanette, who longs for her female friend and so begins doing experiments in her father's lab with the purpose of transforming herself into a man. And she unleashes through this Gilles, her male alter ego, thinking he will help successfully seduce Dahlia, the friend. But unfortunately, as you might be able to predict, Gilles cannot be controlled and has other plans, which include murder. From Winter Editions is a poetry collection called What Just Happened, and this is by Richard Hell. And Richard Hell is an American musician and writer who was in several important early punk rock bands that were really influential at the start of the punk scene in the 1970s. But he actually had moved to New York not to be a musician, but to be a poet, and kind of abandoned that project of being a poet in order to become a punk rocker. Now, 50 years later, this is his first collection of poetry, and I just think that's a really cool story of how this poetry collection came about. But it was written during the pandemic, from what I understand. From University of Pittsburgh Press is a nonfiction called The Age of Mammals, International Paleontology in the Long 19th Century. And this is by Chris Manias. And my kid says he wants to be a paleontologist when he grows up, but that is because he loves dinosaurs. Little does he know that the field of paleontology really got its start with the study of mammals, and mammals are kind of like where it's at, according to this book, in the field of paleontology. And so this book explores the really fascinating and wide-reaching history of the study of mammals within paleontology, and I think that just sounds really interesting, specifically focusing on the 19th century and how kind of the focus was on mammals because there was this perception that humans were like the top of the animal world, and therefore studying mammals was kind of a more important thing to do. So that's a really interesting way of framing this history. So it sounds cool. Another book that I have seen getting a lot of really great mentions is a novel called That Reminds Me, published by And Other Stories, and this is by Derek Owusu. And this is a story told by Kay, a young man living in London who's dealing with depression, and he's telling his life story. So Kay was born to Ghanaian parents in London and had a childhood dealing with foster care and poverty and racism. And it sounds like the form and the structure are really unique and special. So very, very fractured form, but also very poetic. And one review I saw quoted a sentence from the book, and I have to read this sentence because it's so beautiful. So now I breathe British air with airs akin to royal airs. My mum thought she was making a dark life fair. And Bernardine Evaristo calls it a dreamy, impressionistic offering of reassembled fragments of memories, and says it is a vital contribution to our culture and should be very widely read. From Counterpoint is a novel called The Apartment by Ana Menendez, and this is kind of set up as the kind of thing I absolutely love. So this is a novel that observes the lives that take place within one Florida apartment. So it's apartment 2B in Miami Beach. And the novel tracks the occupants of apartment 2B starting in 1942 when a military couple from Texas move in 1942, and then goes all the way up to the most recent inhabitant in 2012, whose name is Lana. And from the publisher's website, it says each tenant imbues 2B with energy that will either heal or overwhelm its latest resident, Lana, a mysterious woman struggling with her own past. That setup just sounds so cool. From New York Review of Books is a novel called The Child and the River by Henry Bosco, and it's translated by Joyce Zonana. And this is a novel that was originally published in 1953, and it's described as a sort of a French Huckleberry Finn, but like not really. So it's the story of a young boy, Pascal, who lives in the Provençal countryside with his family, and he is warned daily by his parents not to go play by the river. But of course, what does he do? He goes and plays by the river and falls asleep in a rowboat, and when he wakes up, he finds himself on an island in the middle of the river inhabited by a band of, the website uses the word gypsies, but perhaps a band of Romani people. That adventure, like the adventure of his journey from there, continues on. But it sounds almost like less like an adventure and more like a spiritual awakening of his deep understanding of the natural world. So the website actually says maybe it should be compared more to Walden than to Huckleberry Finn. Okay, it has started to rain, and between the clouds and the haze from the smoke, it is now very dark, so I apologize for the lighting, but I have more books to share from Verso. There's a novel called Crooked Plow, and it's by Itamar Vieira Jr., and it's translated by Johnny Lorenz. This is a story that starts very focused on one family in rural Brazil, and then expands out to be very much a story about the entire working class population of that region. And it starts with two sisters who are 6 and 7 years old at the beginning of the novel, who find an old knife under their grandmother's bed. And I'll share one sentence from the book. "I heard our grandmother asking what we were doing. 'Say something,' she demanded, threatening to tear out our tongues. Little did she know that one of us was holding her tongue in her hand." So you follow the two sisters' lives from there, and it's in 3 sections. 2 of the sections are narrated by each of the sisters, and then the 3rd section is narrated by a saint, Santa Rita the fisherwoman. Another book from Other Press is Inside Information, and this is by Eshkol Nevo, and it's translated by Sandra Silverstone. And this is described as a novel of psychological suspense that weaves together 3 separate love stories, it says, 3 interlocking stories of couples. So there's a honeymoon gone nightmarishly wrong, a story of a senior doctor who suddenly is overcome by this inexplicable urge to protect a young female resident, and then 3rd, a married couple who is out for a walk, and they're walking along until the husband suddenly disappears without a trace. And it's described as dark and thrilling and turbulent and unconventional love stories. From the Ohio State University Press is a memoir called Birding While Indian, and this is by Thomas C. Gannon, and this is a memoir made up of essays, and they're organized chronologically, spanning the author's 50 years of birding between childhood walks and adult road trips, delivering a compendium of birds recorded and revered. It says the author is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So the essays include stories of the author's traumatic time in a boarding school and in South Dakota, as well as stories of the racism his mother experienced in her life, but then also contains all of these adventures that the author went on while birding, and it's described as an expansive, hilarious, and humane. We've got a lot from Other Press. I feel like this is Tiger Work from Ben Okri, and these are poems, essays, and tales from Booker Prize winning author Ben Okri, and they basically are all a plea on behalf of the planet. In the book, the author pleads for other artists to dedicate themselves to what he calls existential creativity, and he writes, "It means everything I write should be directed to the immediate end of drawing attention to the dire position we are in as a species." From Yale University is a book called The 7 Measures of the World by Pierre L. Martin, and this is nonfiction again, about the seven what the author describes as the 7 essential units of measurement. So it includes the meter, the second, the kilogram, the Kelvin, the ampere, the mole, and the candela. And so using like a bunch of vignettes, the author shares the history and the function and the important contributions to all sorts of areas of science that each of these 7 measurements has had. And explores how the entire universe can be measured in just 7 units. From Nightboat Books is a poetry collection called Hydra Medusa by Brandon Shimoda. I'm going to read the blurb because poetry collections are hard to describe, notoriously for me. So it's described as part coping mechanism, part magical act. Hydra Medusa was composed while Brandon Shimoda was working 5 jobs and raising a child, composed during bus commutes before bed at sunrise. Encountering the ghosts of Japanese American ancestors, friends, children, and bodies of water, the collection asks, what is the desert but a site where people have died, are dying, are buried, unburied, memorialized, erased? And Cristina Rivera Garza says, Brandon Shimoda knows his way around the dead. And so it sounds like a collection filled with spirits and engaging with death and ancestors, and it just sounds really, really fantastic and has a lot of great praise from really wonderful authors like Cristina Rivera Garza. And finally, the most recently published book on this list, at least, is from Fitzcarraldo Editions, and it is the second in their new classics series, the second book in their new series, and it is A Very Easy Death by Simone de Beauvoir. And this is de Beauvoir's unflinching account of her mother's decline and last final days, and it features an introduction from Ali Smith. And it's described as the moment-by-moment harrowing recounting of Simone de Beauvoir's mother's final days after she experienced a fall and was taken to the hospital and really had what sounds like a really horrific final few days of her life. So again, to use the same word, it sounds particularly harrowing, and it is, again, the second book in Fitzcarraldo's new classics series. So to end on that happy note, that was a very long list of books that were published in June, and those are just the books that caught my eye. There are so many more out there. If you know of any other books that have been published recently that have caught your eye, especially those from independent publishers, I hope you'll mention them in the comments below and let me know what you've been reading recently. I'll share kind of what I've been reading recently. I already told you that I've been reading At the Edge of the Woods by Kathryn Bromwich, which is absolutely beautiful so far. And then from Tortoise Books, I am reading a memoir. This is amazing. This is Strip by Hannah Sward. Again, this is from Tortoise Books. This is the story of Hannah, who had a rough childhood. Her parents split up. She kind of split her time between her father's kind of very bohemian poet lifestyle and her mother's house in Florida. Her father and her mother kind of dated and ran through men and women in their respective households, and Hannah was molested several times as a child. Pretty harrowing experience as a child, and she eventually, I haven't quite gotten to this part in the book, I'm just barely there. She actually turns to prostitution to earn money to be able to go to school. She wants to be an actor, and so she moves to Chicago and signs up for an escort service, and this is very beautifully written. I mostly read at night. It is like so emotional to read some of these sections that are happening to her in her young adulthood that I can't actually read it quite before bed, and what a luxury for me. Like, I can't read, I can choose to not read a book like this before I go to bed because it keeps me up at night. Yes, that's, talk about privilege. That's certainly right up there. It's beautiful. It's really, really, really wonderful. And I'm not someone who really reads a ton of memoirs. Highly recommend so far. So I can't wait to tell you about the rest of it. Little show and tell. I always like to end on a little show and tell. This is one of my favorite cooking seasons is the summer, and so I've been doing a lot of visiting our local farmers market and doing as much cooking as I can from our fresh produce from our farmers market. And so I have a favorite cake that I make all the time. It's actually, the recipe's for a strawberry cake. It's from Martha Stewart. I like to change up the fruit that I use in the cake, and so I made it this time with cherries and rhubarb from our local farmers market, and it was delicious. So I'll leave the recipe for the strawberry version below. You can kind of change it up with any berry or other kinds of fruit too. So if you're still around, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found something great to read from this list, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.